Yes, that is fine. I'll be the spotlight. That's me in the spotlight, celebrating my religion, to change the lyrics of a song a little bit. And that's fine over there. And let's go back to the translation, and good. I think that puts everything where it needs to be. And look at that, it's 7:01. We're on spring break here, so it was a little easier to make sure everything was starting on time. I wasn't rushing back from school. Okay, well, I don't see any reason to wait. The regulars on our Zoom are there, and whoever wants to log in through YouTube can do so. And of course, whoever comes late can always watch the recording to make up for lost time. All right, so we are picking up in chapter number 5. We are almost about halfway through the chapters of Mikvaot. Woohoo! Hopefully we've picked up a lot, but we're going to need to remind ourselves of some very special rules here in chapter 5 about the Mayan, about a spring. So a spring is a natural upwelling of water. If you live here in Florida, there are beautiful springs all over the state, absolutely gorgeous places of natural beauty, just amazing the way the water bubbles up and is just so crystal clear. Highly recommend going to them, especially when summer gets here and they're a little bit warmer compared to the where they are now. But what does a spring mean for the mikvah status? And mikvah here used in the generic sense. Well, a spring is not a mikvah. In fact, a spring is better than a mikvah because a spring can be used in a few ways that would not work for a mikvah. Most importantly, for a mikvah, the technical term mikvah, again, not the generic term we use in the modern world, but for a technical mikvah, that 40 seah container of water or collection of water, that's the better word, that one needs to have 40 seahs before it can do any job at all. And 2, it needs to be stopped. A regular mikvah cannot be flowing. It has to be a still collection of waters. A mayan, on the other hand, can be running, and indeed that's normal for the spring water to be running, but it can also purify anything that will fit into it. So if you have a very small stream coming out of this spring and you want to purify a fork, you can put the fork into that tiny little stream and the fork can be rendered pure thanks to the stream. Wonderful. That doesn't work if you have a super tiny mikvah that's under 40 seahs. It doesn't work. Even if you have a collection of mikvah waters that is big enough for the fork, if it hasn't reached that critical mass of 40 seahs, it doesn't do bubkis. A mayan, on the other hand, can. So even a very, very small spring can still purify very, very small things. And like I mentioned, it can do it even while running. All of that's going to be very important background information to remember as we get into chapter 5. So let me just double check. Do people understand those 2 main principles? Okay, not hearing any problems, so let's get into it then. So with regards to this mayan, a spring, water from a spring, which is made to pass over into a trough, becomes invalid. All right, so what's happening here? Well, we have a man-made channel for the water that is not part of the ground, but has been put onto the ground. So think like a stone groove that was carved and then placed to guide the spring waters. Everybody following the image? And the water of the spring is now into this trough. So it's like a U shape and the water's going down the center. Okay, well, the water in the middle is now no longer following the same status as the spring that is feeding that water. The water in that middle cannot be used for any purification purposes. Even though it is still kind of sort of water from the spring, it is now considered to be drawn water. It is collected water, and thus it would have to follow the regular rules of a mikveh for it to be used. So the water in that channel is not valid. Good. Part 2. If it was made to pass over the edge in any quantity. So now you have the water flowing through the trough, through the groove, but there is too much water for the groove. And so the water is bubbling over the top of the groove. So there is excess, runoff, whatever term you want to use. So now it's the trough water plus the extra water that is literally overflowing the groove. Then what is outside the trough is valid, for the water of a spring purifies however little its quantity. So that water that is on the edges of the trough, not the part that's in the middle, but on the edges, the overflow, that water is still considered to be spring water from the Mayan, just as if it was in the lake originally. And that means if you are purifying your fork and you are submerging it in that overflow, as long as it is sufficient to cover completely the item, that is fine. Even though if you put the fork in the middle of the groove, it wouldn't be a proper purification. Putting it in the overflow of that groove would be. Now, you might be thinking, but wait a minute, isn't the overflow contaminated by the water inside? And the answer is they are mixed, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. But the water from the spring, which is the water on the outside that has not been collected, is considered to validate all the rest of that water that's there. That little bit of the extra spring water that hasn't gone into the channel is considered to be not collected, and therefore it is still doing its job of not only purifying, but of repurifying anything else that is in its state and not within that trough. Okay, before we get to the next situation, is that clear?
No, sorry. Can you repeat it in 30 seconds? All this explanation, because I have with a ball and it's difficult to concentrate.
So this is the extra effort that makes for more merit in your study. So the basic issue is, if I have a channel, a groove that the water is going through, the water in the groove is not considered suitable for doing purification. Even though it's still connected to the Mayan, to the spring, once it is gathered up in that channel, in that groove, it is now not considered kosher. But if in my groove there is water that is over the edge, that isn't in the middle, but is over the edge coming out of the spring, then that water is still considered to be like the spring water. And therefore I can still use it and still purify items in that runoff over the top of the groove. So if it's only in the groove, I wish I was a better artist or mime. If it was only in the groove, here we go. If like that. Does that work in the camera? Right. So here's our groove. If the water is only in the groove, then that water is no good. If the water is over the edge of the groove, like there's so much water that it's over the top and there's water falling off the edges, that water can be used for purification still.
Yeah, because the water need to flow free.
Exactly.
That's the difference. Okay, got
it has not been drawn. Yeah. It's not been gathered. Yes. And Aaron, your hand is up.
Doesn't have any limitation, any border.
Exactly.
Yes, Rabbi, I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. My understanding is when you intentionally direct the flow of water, it constitutes drawn water, which is why the water in the groove is invalid. But the water that's overflowing, since it's not being directed by the person, is the equivalent of a spring water. And that's why it is valid. Is that correct?
So as we've often discussed, yes, but I would hesitate to define the rule in the method that you're using, because I think we can both agree that having this groove is still directing even the water that's on the edges and that's outside of it. I mean, sure, a lot of it is spilling and not going to your ultimate destination, but there is still directionality. And we're going to talk about collecting this water, both of it, the mix at the other end. So I don't want to use the word undirected, because that I think would lead to the wrong understanding here. But it hasn't been collected in a strict term because it's not in the groove itself. It isn't actually inside the vessel. And that inside versus on the outside is an important distinction that the rabbis are trying to make. And it's, I think, a more important or a clearer way of putting it than directing, because directing it, like I said, we will see ways of steering this water that makes it perfectly fine. But there are some ways of steering that are better than other ways of steering.
I had a question about the steering. The steering has to come from the mikvah, but can you steer what they call living water or flowing water?
We're going to cover that as we go through the rest of the Masechet. And yes, there are ways to guide that water, but it's not as it's not as simple as just taking a bucket. That's where we definitely cross the line. So trying to find ways to encourage the water to go where you want it to go, like, for example, collecting the rainwater off the roof down a spigot. There are ways to do that, and the water remains the Mayim Chayim. It remains natural and suitable for creating a mikveh or for immersing in any portion, etc. But the rules of that are what we're discovering as we go through the Masechet. And here we see that the outer water could still be directed and valid, but the inner water would not be while it is still inner. But we're going to have to deal with how we mix that water eventually. But let's continue here in Mishnah 1, which is picking up here on paragraph 3 from Dr. Kolb's translation and commentary. If it is made to pass over into a pool and then is stopped, the pool counts as a mikveh. Okay, so we had our channel going down our groove, and then near the end, the channel basically stops, and so the water that was both overflowing as well as the water from inside the groove mixes and then flows into our basin, whatever our gathering point is. That can then become a mikveh. Even though some of the water passed through the channel and might have been considered a gathered water, the fact that the outer water is still part of that mayan, that spring, means that when it reaches the mikveh and the inn, reaches the actual gathering place, that the water that goes into it can be a kosher mikveh, as long as we have our 40 seyas and it's treated like a technical mikveh. And that means as well that the flow has to be stopped. So that it is possible to create a mikveh in this way, which is why I just said it's not exactly a question against direction. It's a question of how is it being directed. Yes, Aaron.
So in this case, my reading of this Mishnah was it wasn't directed into the pool. They just stopped it there, kind of like a beaver building a dam.
Well, I mean, it was directed through the channel, so there was definitely a channeling in the trough to begin with, and that's I would say a little different than a beaver. I'm not 100% of an expert on beavers, but I don't think they dig grooves. Right. It's not a matter of let me back up. Everybody agrees that if you just stop up the mayan, if you build a wall, although we'll talk about how that can be done, that potentially that could just create a larger gathering spot at the spring itself. But this is really, it's gone through the groove, it's gone through the trough, and then it's entered into a secondary gathering point. And that's the one that has to be treated like a regular mikvah, meaning 40 seahs, and it has to be no longer flowing for it to be used as a mikvah. Unlike the spring itself, which can be used even when it's less than 40 for smaller objects, not for a person, and even though it can be used while flowing.
And Rabbi, is trough and channel basically the same thing?
Yeah, well, I'm using them more or less interchangeably here. Now, right now, we're using the worst case scenario for our trough, which is to say this is an actual vessel. This is a man carved, fashioned item that is separate from the ground and then placed into position. So, you know, if you want to think of it even as like being a stone gutter that was carved and then put into place. So since it is a vessel, that's what's making it drawn water inside of it. If it was being carved from the rock itself, meaning from the natural flow, well, that was something we talked about last week, and that there are a lot more. There's a lot more leniency for a trough that is carved into the ground, as opposed to a trough attached to the ground. That is to say, put into place. Yeah.
So how come the trough in this situation becomes valid when the previous situation it wasn't valid?
And that goes back to our key word for tonight, the mayan, the spring. The spring water makes it different.
But wasn't the trough we just read from spring water?
No, the trough we read about in the previous one was from rainwater. And that has a different set of rules, which actually we're going to probably get to, I think, tonight as well. We'll eventually get to it, no, that I can guarantee. But the rainwater has slightly different rules because it is not a continually flowing or naturally upwelling kind of water. It is, you know, something that comes very occasionally. Well, even here in Florida, we would say occasionally. So the mayan has a very different status. It's kind of like the perfect water source, as opposed to rainwater, which is which has some different issues with it. That's why we talked about the trough in last week's discussion about being put upon by a rain spout from water that's coming in off the roof. Whereas here we're talking about the natural mayan, the natural spring.
Sorry, what is trough?
The groove, the gutter, the carved structure that the water is being funneled through.
So why do you say that mayan is better than river? I thought that river is the ideal.
I didn't say it was better than a river. I said it was better than rainwater.
Oh, okay.
Rainwater, like off the roof, has a different status, or rainwater that's just coming down the hill, but not coming from a river or a natural spring. But rivers are considered to come from springs somewhere. That's where rivers begin. Okay, so that is so far. Let me get back down to where we were. Oh, yes. So we're on paragraph 4 here of Dr. Kolb's translation. If it is made to flow again, it is invalid for zavim and those with skin disease, meaning the metzora, and for the preparation of hatat waters, which we read about in the maftir last week, for the red heifer waters, until it is known that the former water is gone. All right, so what's going on here? Well, we saw that we created a mikvah out of this spring water in the last paragraph. But what happens if we unblock the gathering and allow the water to pour in and in and in and in and in until we have calculated that enough water has come in that the water that was gathered has now gone away? Well, if you reach that point, then this is now considered to be truly the mayim chayim, that upper level of water, which means it can be used for those 3 special categories: the zav, the Metzora and for the Chatat waters. So remember, those are the only three things that you need the technical definition of Mayim Chayim for. Every other use of purification waters can be done even in a mikvah with the 40 sayas as we normally use. And here we're finding out that you can temporarily turn it into a mikvah by stopping it up, and with the trough and all of that. But if you remove that and allow it to recycle the water, meaning replace the water is better, then it can regain, that's better, regain its mayan status, its mayim chayim status, and be used even for the three most difficult circumstances. All right, so yeah, spring water is fancy stuff. It does a lot of good, because after all, this is the sort of classic origin of water. So we see a certain parallel here, not strictly speaking, more metaphorically, that just as there are different degrees of impurity, beginning with the most stringent and the most pervasive, meaning the ones that will pass to other things most easily, we also have a higher degree of water for this purification. And this is our peak form of purification water. All right, Mishnah 2. If it, and again, we're still talking about spring water, if it was made to pass over the outside of vessels or over a bench, well, Rabbi Yehuda says, behold, it remains as it was before. Rabbi Yossi says, behold, it is like a mikveh, except that one may not immerse anything above the bench. Okay, so we have another question. What happens if we have an item that can become ritually impure, such as a jar or a bench, and the water is not going into it, but the water is going over it? It's still in contact with it. There is still this item there as a man-made.
What is a bench for you, Rabbi?
A bench, like like when you sit in the park, it's a chair.
So how can a bench limited water? Of course, it's not. How can they use to canalize the water?
Well, it's here. We're not talking about using it to direct the water. Here we're talking about what happens if the water is flowing and somebody had buried a pot in the stream. Somebody had buried a bench in the stream. So the water is still going through the stream, but it's also going across these items. So does the water status change?
Rabbi.
Yes.
It says pass over the outside, because I took this to mean that it was hitting the outside of the vase or vessel, but
Yes.
not actually filling it up.
Correct. You are absolutely right. This is definitely going on the outside of the items. So did you have a question, or was that you just confirming?
I was just confirming I was reading it right. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if it was going into it, then we have the issue of drawn water, and then it gets much more like we saw in Mishnah 1. But here it is on the outside and only on the outside. And so the argument here between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi is whether or not the water that is flowing over these items changes its status or not. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says, nope, no change whatsoever. However, Rabbi Yossi says, no, now it works like a mikveh, meaning that its status is down a notch, and you can't use it unless it has 40 sayas in it, and it is no longer moving. And of course, it cannot work for the zav or for the metzora or for the chatat waters. That it is like a that level of mikveh that we're more familiar with, rather than being spring water at this point. That it cannot be considered as the pristine waters that the spring water has because of the item. On the other hand, it's also not ruined. We can still use the water, We're just using it like a mikveh rather than like a mayan, rather than like a spring. But we do have to make sure we don't do things over the bench, because that would be a sort of a particular spot immediately over them that would be like drawn water. And that means that we could submerge things after it, but not immediately above the items that are causing this problem. Yes, Natan.
But I don't get what's the problem, because if anyway there's water all around the object, it's like having a fish. It's the same. The bench and the fish is the same. It's an object, a small object that is go over water for every plate, doesn't stop the flow of the water. So I don't understand what's the issue here.
So, I mean, you're right, and that's the underlying question here is, what is the actual issue? Now, Rabbi Yehuda says there is no issue. It's still a spring. Like you said, if the spring can go around a fish, why can't it go around a bench?
Yeah.
And we don't consider the fish to be changing it. The whole point of Mayim Chayim is that it is uncorruptible, that it cannot be changed. But Rabbi Yosei is very particular that if there is this man-made object, this item that can contract tuma, unlike a fish, unlike a living animal, unlike other things that are just naturally in the river, that since this is a man-made object and thus susceptible to tuma, that we do have a general principle that we are not supposed to build a source of immersion with anything that can be rendered tameh. And we're going to talk about that in more detail later on in the Masechet. So he seems to be feeling that, okay, fine, yes, there is enough of the water that as it flows, it will re-purify itself, but it's not really full Mayim Chayim as long as it is still interacting with this water. The same as with the trough. But yes, this may have a lot more extra water than our trough example back in the Mishnah 1, but it's still like a trough, that the water is still going through a man-made object, even if it's just a little, which is why he says the water right above the man-made object can't be used. That would be like the water in the trough that we learned about in Mishnah 1, and that means that water right there is definitely not usable. And since it's now a bit of a mixture, he is downgrading the status of the overall stream from that point. Does that make a little more sense? Now, again, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. It's not that Rabbi Yossi is a slam dunk. That this is, a machloket. And these arguments are going to continue in the next few Mishnayot. All right. Excuse me. Mishnah 3. If water from a spring that flows into many channels was increased in quantity so that it was made to flow in abundance, it remains as it was before. All right. So first of all, I just have to point out that I'm glad that Dr. Kolp mentions this in the commentary, but I wish he had left it in the translation, because this is where I got to learn what the Hebrew word is for centipede, nadal. Right? So it's like a bug. Now he translates that as many channels, but imagine you are looking down on the spring, and the spring flows out like the legs of a bug, and it's flowing like body piece, body piece, body piece. So there's multiple segments to the spring. So it can be sort of radially, or it can be like in a line, but you have this multiple pieces to the spring, which are all connected by the flow, but that is our situation. Now, what's the issue? Well, what happens if I take my barrel and I dump more water into the spring so that the spring comes up and pushes more water into these outflowing pools, into this additional chambers? Well, it's not technically a chamber, but into these additional gathering points of the spring water. And the answer is, it's okay. Even though you're using drawn water, to add to the spring, because those additional gathering points were already connected, even by just a little bit of a flow. Now that you've increased the flow, presumably with a mixture of the water that was dumped in from your barrel, it is still considered to be like a mayan. It is still considered to be like spring water, and you can use it for all the things that you would use a spring water for. So this is a way of increasing the flow of a spring by adding drawn water to it. But you'll notice that it has to already have this centipede-like structure to begin with. Because if we come down here to the next one, if it was standing, meaning it was not a centipede, it was not flowing over into other little channels, but just a very big puddle. Imagine you're at the edge of a cave, and there's the cave is full of water, but it hasn't left the cave. But you would very much like it to leave the cave, because right outside the cave, there are very nice areas for the water to gather that would make for a wonderful place that you could then use. But there isn't enough water in the cave to flow over. So you've got your big puddle and you want to make it go further. So the quantity was increased. You dump your barrels of water into the cave, and now it's got enough that it's flowing out. Well, then it is equal to a mikvah. It is not considered a spring because you're the one making it overflow. You're not adding to the overflow, you're creating the overflow. And yes, as a mikvah, it can purify as long as the water isn't moving, without, that it has to be standing water. And it is still a little bit like a spring, because after all, the water that's coming out is this mixture of spring water and drawn water. And that means you can purify other things in the overflow even if it is less than 40 sayas. Now, again, that won't work for a person, but you can put your fork into these overflows and it'll work. So it becomes a bit of a hybrid. It becomes a little bit of a combination at this point. It's not following all the rules of the spring water because you're the one that made it overflow, but it is still mostly spring water. And as such, it is going to follow some of the spring water rules. All right, on to 5.4. Don't see any questions. Okay. All right. Oh, no, don't go down because I want to get our introduction there on the top. We are now going down to the ocean. We're going to the sea. And as we're going to see, the sea has its own special question marks. All seas are equivalent to a mikveh, for it is said, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, taken from Bereshit, chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, the words of Rebbe Meir. All right, so Rebbe Meir's position is that the ocean is not the same as a mayan, that the ocean is different than a spring. Now, some of you, I'm sure, are thinking, but wait a minute, how could the ocean be different than a spring? The spring and the ocean are basically the same, right? I mean, it's natural water, it's flowing and all of that other good stuff. Well, we have to look at the terminology. When we look at the terminology, it says that God gathered the waters and called them a sea. Well, what's that word for gathering? Well, it's related to the word mikvah. So if the gathering of the original seas from creation is called a type of mikvah, then that means that the ocean itself is also like a mikvah. Now, again, that's not a bad thing. You can still use the mikvah for almost anything, but those three things, the zav, the mitzora, and the chatat waters, you can't use the ocean for doing that. And his argument is that that goes for anything that is called a yam, anything that is called a sea. Now, he is not the only opinion. Let's move down here just slowly so people can read the commentary if they would like. Oh, Aaron, yes, before we get to the next opinion of Rabbi Yehuda.
I had a question. The zav, that's the discharge. Isn't that used? I thought the mikveh was used to purify that in modern times a lot.
It gets complicated. We'll have to loop back onto exactly what the status of a Zav is in the modern world. But with regards to the Torah terminology for a Zav, it is stated expressly there that it has to be Mayim Chayim, as opposed to other forms of discharge, which are reflected in the word just Mayim. So I don't want to get into all of the degrees of difference between the different terminology. So for the moment, let's just call that the Deoraita, the biblical Zav, that needs this Mayim Chayim. One of the reasons why we're studying Mikvaot now is to get some of the categories at least on the table. And then when we cover other issues within the Seder, we'll talk about the different types of purity of different things. Like I said, hopefully even getting to maybe Nida next, but we'll see if people are still interested in purity legislation by the time we get there. Rabbi Yehuda says, only the great sea is equivalent to a mikveh, for it says seas, only because there are in it many kinds of seas. So Rabbi Yehuda says, well, no, hold on a second. When we talk about the seas in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, that could be only referring to the Great Sea, which is basically the Mediterranean. And the reason why it's using the plural is because the Mediterranean is connected to multiple bodies of water, which are called seas. It's connected to the Adriatic, to the Aegean, it's connected to the Atlantic, although exactly how much of that they knew at the time is a little unclear because of the geography knowledge of the moment, but they certainly knew that the Mediterranean was more than just the coast of Israel. And they therefore knew that there were additional seas, things that were called seas, that were part of the Mediterranean. Therefore, if we're going to talk about a sea being the mikveh, that only means the Great Sea, which nowadays would mean pretty much just the actual oceans that we talk about. So, the actual Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian, those kinds of things, that would all be considered a yam. But something like the Caspian Sea, for example, which is inland and not connected to the oceans of the world, would not be part of that definition. Now, Rabbi Yossi has his own opinion. Rabbi Yossi says all seas afford cleanness, meaning they all work just fine when running. And yet they are unfit for Zavim and Matzoraim and for the preparation of the Chatat waters. So Rabbi Yossi has a slightly different interpretation, where he is still agreeing that an ocean is not considered to be Mayim Chayim. It's not considered to be the technical definition of living waters. Only the Mayan, those natural running springs, fit that definition. But the oceans can work as a purification source for everything else, regardless of whether it is the Mediterranean or the Caspian, as long as it is even while it is running, unlike a mikvah, which doesn't work when it is running. So he is giving it a higher status than a normal mikvah, but it is still not hitting the perfect water status that a spring has.
So why they are not Mayim Chaim, the ocean?
Well, partly it's because they are referred to in Bereshit as a mikvah, with God gathering the oceans a mikvah.
Okay.
And partly I think there is also this idea that we discovered earlier that, bad water is not as agreeable for the mikvah, that it doesn't have the Mayim Chayim status either. Even if it is natural spring water, if the water is off, like sulfurous, for example, then it doesn't count in that same category. So certainly the salt water of the ocean would also have been negatively felt. But the primary reason here is the one of the halakhic midrash, that as the oceans are referred to like a mikvah, all that's left is to figure out the exact definition of how are they like a mikveh, but that certainly means they are not technically mayim chayim.
So only Mayan can be fit for Sabim, Etzoraim, and Atat what? And
Exactly.
preparation of Khatat. Only Mayanim. That's
Exactly.
it. Nothing
That's
else.
it. But only for those three things do you need a mayan. Meaning every other purification need can be done with a mikveh, with the ocean, or anything else. Okay, on to 5.5. Let's get a little bit more there. Flowing water is considered like a spring, and dripping water is considered like a mikveh. All right, so here we're getting into our question of assumptions. So we see water that is coming and flowing. Then how do we classify it if we're not sure what its origin is? If we don't know exactly what that water coming down the hill is? Is it coming from a spring? Is it coming from like a rain outpouring? What exactly is going on here? Well, the basic assumption is if it is flowing, meaning that it is a continual flowing kind of motion, then we can assume that this is from a mayan, that it is from a spring. On the other hand, if it is dripping, meaning that there are slower amounts that are coming down, bit by bit, then we can assume that this is coming from Geshem, from the rain. And as such, well, that means we'll have to treat it like a mikveh, meaning it needs to be gathered, it needs to be 40 seyas, it needs to be stopped. So it would be ruled like that. Now, again, both of these are fine for 99% of what we need to do for purification, but they are different assumptions. However, Rabbi Tzadok testified that if flowing water exceeded dripping water, meaning they are mixing, and you've got 51% flowing and 49% dripping, then it is valid, just as though it came 100% for the mayan, from the mayan. So Tzadok is considering this as being overridden by the spring waters, which, as we have already said, it is always pure. It cannot be contaminated and all of those things. So the fact that it has mixed is not a problem, just like way back in our first trough discussion in Mishnah 5.1. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, when you said that it has to be more flowing water, it has to be noticeably more, though, right? You can't just have 51-49, right?
Well, I'm using it as a bit of hyperbole, perhaps, but they also are not saying that you need to get out a hydrometer. I don't know what you would use for measuring the quantity of flow, but yes, if it is only 51%, but you're sure of that, then yes, that's fine. So if there is some way of knowing that, but the basic principle here isn't how do you achieve this measurement. The basic principle here is what happens if this were the case. Again, they are dealing with a hypothetical here more than the practical halacha l'maaseh, more than what we actually would be doing manually.
I was just comparing it to the Passover thing. When you break the matzah, my understanding was if you can't tell which one's bigger by looking at it, you got to break it again.
I've never had a matzah that had that problem. So I never came across that halakha. I'd be interested to know the derivation of that. But yeah, whenever I break a matzah, it never comes close to breaking 49-51.
Yeah, it could be wrong. I didn't read that anywhere. A rabbi brought it up.
I mean, it's an interesting idea that you need to make sure the afikomen comes from the larger piece, and you need to be celebrating the lechem oni, the bread of affliction, from the minor piece. That is an important part of the telling of the story, is having less than, and so the diminished piece is an important character in the Magid and the retelling of the Exodus. And like I said, the afikomen is an important part of bringing us that satiation and completion at the end of the meal. So I get where it's coming from. I just have never heard it stated as a halakha with the idea of having to replace it. All right. Situation number 2. If dripping water became flowing water. All right. So now the dripping water has increased its flow and it's become now more like something we would call flowing water. It's coming down into a river or into a wadi.
So dripping water is from raining.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it could technically be from a spring, but you would assume it wasn't Mayan status water if it is only dripping. Like if the spring is only dripping a little bit from a crack in the rock, and you're just looking at it, okay, it's just dripping. I need to treat just like a mikvah. But once it's pouring, then I can treat it like a mayan.
There's no problem if it's dripping like between the rocks, and I manipulate the rocks in order to create a bigger flow of water, like made by me, a human. It's still okay.
If you break open the rocks to let more water out, that is absolutely fine. No problem.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay.
There are other things that might be a problem, which we're going to talk about now on the other end. So breaking open is okay, but if it becomes flowing water, its flow may be blocked by a stick or by a reed or even by a zav or zava, and then one may go down and immerse oneself in it. The words of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says, all right, look, the dripping water is like flowing water, and flowing water can't be stopped by anything. It's always good. It's mayan. We're wonderful. So if you need to bunch it up to make a gathering deep enough to actually immerse in it, then you can build a little dam. So here we're back to your beaver question, Natan. And Rabbi Yehuda says, since this is now flowing water, it's no problem. You can put a stick or a reed, a natural object, or even a zav or zava, meaning they can put their hand or their foot to block the water so that it builds up in the gathering spot. And that's perfectly fine. Go down and use it now that it is a deep enough cavity to fit in. And now, obviously, a zav or zava is somebody that is ritually impure, and that seems a little problematic. And indeed, Rabbi Yossi will respond, one may not stop the flow of water with anything which is liable to uncleanness. So he is saying, and indeed this is the halakha, that you cannot stop that flow with something that itself could become ritually impure. And a human being can become ritually impure. That's kind of like how we got into all this mess of needing to immerse in the first place. So
yeah.
What could you use? You could use a rock.
Okay.
Right?
So what could happen if a Zava or someone impure try to block the water? The water is still always pure. So what could happen? That the level download the level of purity of the water?
So it would be, the water itself would still be technically fine, and once they moved away, there's no issue. But the water that gathered because of them blocking it would not be considered valid for immersing yourself in it. So if you dunked yourself in this extra dammed water that they put their foot in, or put their foot next to stop, then you are not considered to have become ritually pure. And now you'll have to find a different water source to immerse yourself in that doesn't have that problem. All right, and that's just a little bit more there at the bottom. And we're on to
I had a question.
Oh, yes.
How come if it can become impure, you can't use it to guide the water?
How for which, the person or what?
It said if you use a vessel that can become ritually impure, it can't be used to dam the water.
You're correct. You cannot complete the mikvah creation with an object that can become ritually impure. So go ahead.
What makes it like, I was gonna say, no, what makes it like, what's the reasoning for that? Because so far the main thing that makes it invalid is drawn water, and this seems to be a little different.
Exactly right. And this is, like I said, this is an additional stringency that the Chachamim have in order to complete the mikvah, so to speak, that it needs to be made not with an implement that is susceptible to uncleanness. So this is a bonus stringency.
And the interesting thing about this one is it seems like the reason you can move it is because now it's no longer rainwater. The rainwater has turned into flowing water. And I thought earlier we could use a trout, which is susceptible to impurity. Is that right?
Right. So before we did have that trough, but there, very importantly, the water would mix before it got into the gathering place itself. So the water in the trough and the water outside the trough would mingle before it went in to the mikvah. And we studied that in one of our earlier Mishnayot as well, about the water joining together before it went down the hill and into the mikvah and at the bottom. So here we have the actual mikvah itself, the edge of the mikvah is being created by this object liable to uncleanness. So it is different than something that played a role in the journey of the water. This is actually the final step of creating the mikvah. And yes, it is not intuitive, and it is not a necessarily obvious additional requirement, but it is nonetheless a requirement that the Mishnah has put for us and that the Chachamim agree with. All right, let's get back to the ocean. If a wave was separated from the sea and was 40 seahs, and it fell on a man or on vessels, they become clean. All right, so here we have a question. Can you have a moving mikvah that isn't actually in a container? And the answer is yes, kind of. So imagine you have somebody who is down at the edge of the beach, and they are sitting at the edge of the beach, and they're not in the water, but they're on the sand. And they or their items are ritually impure. And then a really big freak wave comes along that has at least 40 seahs in it. It's got a lot of water in that wave. And it comes up and it is traveling along the edge of the sand, even though the rest of the water has now left it behind. So it's like the last crashing bit of the wave. So it's just a giant sploosh of water, a huge drop of water, if you will, flying in from the edge of the ocean. Well, yes, even though mikvahs normally have to be gathered in something, and even though normally it doesn't count if it's moving, in this case, the ocean water will work, and you would be rendered ritually pure in that circumstance. Yes, Natan?
How can you calculate the size of the wave, if it's half enough or not? Because it's very subjective. I think that this wave is big, have maybe enough water also, but maybe it's not. And I cannot gathering the water, because if not, become to be unfit by definition. So how can you know really when a wave is big enough?
So you may have noticed, but nobody builds a platform near the ocean and calls it a occasional mikvah. Maybe the wave will be big enough. Right? No one counts on this in the modern world. Nobody counted on this in the ancient world. Instead, what they are trying to discuss here is the status of the water from the ocean and how it is a little different than a traditional mikvah. So yes, it's not mayim chayim, but it is still better than a regular mikvah, because here we are, it's still flowing. However, it does still have to have 40 seahs. So it's not about giving you practical advice. It's about telling you what the status of the ocean water is.
Because I was thinking one step ahead and say, oh, great. So sometimes we need to purify something. So we can go to the beach if you live in a town with a beach and just put near the coast, okay, near. So when you come a few waves coming, you just can purify through there and that's it. You don't need a mikveh. And sometimes happen that you can have something impure, I don't know, something,
Yeah.
I don't know.
But
I'm tired enough to think about examples, but
well, that's because I can give you a solution that's much easier. If you live near the ocean, like I did when I was in California, well, not near the ocean, don't get me wrong, I wasn't in that tax bracket, but living within easy driving distance, you could go into the ocean and just immerse things in the ocean. You don't need to worry about a random wave. You can just go for a swim, and that's perfectly fine. Or if you go off a pier, you can lower something in a bucket, and douse it in the ocean. If you want to stay dry but immerse your items, you can do it, from the dock. That's also fine. So this is really a hypothetical that is not intended to give us practical advice. Because if you live near the ocean, it's much easier.
You need to just a few 1 second. That's it. It's not like you need a minimum of time.
No, you don't need to worry about counting.
Okay.
All right, so let's finish up 5-6 here. Any place containing 40 sayas is valid for immersing oneself and for immersing other things. All right, so this is going to get a little weird, but bear with me. What the rabbis are trying to say here is that when you create a spot, or if you find a spot for a mikvah, this is not a mayan, this is not the ocean, this is just a mikvah like we're more familiar with. It doesn't really matter what shape it is. As long as it's big enough for 40 sayas, it's going to be fine. For example, one may immerse in trenches or in ditches or even in a donkey track whose water is connected in a valley. All right, so trenches, the commentators talk about like a square shape, trough that's been dug down into the ground. Ditches are the ones that have sloped sides, but still, if it's got 40 sayas, that's fine, as long as it is deep enough. And even the donkey tracks, meaning even the part that has been stamped down by the horses and maybe by the wagon wheels, so it's got a little bit of a groove. Well, you can imagine that being very long because it's, the long stretch of road that has been stamped down. That could still be 40 sayas, even if it's very shallow, as long as it's all connected.
Sorry, what is the volume for 40 sayas in meters?
In liters? Hold on a second. Yes. I'm going to find let me give a quick Google calculation. Okay, so 40 sayas, if I remember correctly, is anywhere between 150 and 200 gallons, which is giving me about 650 liters.
650 liters.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's not a lot, but it's also not nothing.
It's a lot. 650 liters is a lot.
Yes, but when we're comparing it to like a swimming pool, it's like nothing. If you compare it, a swimming pool is like 20,000 gallons.
Liters?
It's like you and your metric system.
Oh yeah, and your conventional system.
2 liters. So like a swimming pool, a decent sized swimming pool is like 75,000 liters.
So the one at your house is 70,000 liters in your house.
Something like that, yeah. I mean, I haven't measured my pool recently as it came with the house.
But it's like 10% of your swimming pool.
Exactly, which, is not small, but it's also not huge for water. A lake or a pond are almost always going to be bigger than that. So I'm just trying to make sure you understand
1%.
that.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. You could have a very small, area that's been stamped on by the horses. And technically that could have a few hundred gallons in it, a few hundred liters in it, and be large enough to be considered a mikvah. Now, there are still rules about whether or not you would be deep enough for the person to use as a personal mikveh. But even if it wasn't deep enough for a person to lie down in and use, you could still submerge other things if it was a kosher mikveh for all other measures. Now, we get one argument here from Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai says one may immerse in a rain torrent, but Beit Hillel says one may not immerse. So Beit Shammai is saying that if there is 40 seahs of water that is just flooding down from the rain, that is sufficient. Even though it's just like one big hose run, that as long as it is 40 seahs in scope or larger, that is fine, even if it's not technically gathered in any particular way. Beit Hillel, of course, argues no, that yes, even though it is rainwater, which is normally, kind of a very good thing for making a mikveh out of, that it does still need to be actually gathered. I mean, the word mikveh itself means to gather. This is one of those cases where you might argue that Beit Hillel is being more strict than Beit Shammai. On the other hand, you may argue that Beit Shammai is being more strict in creating ways to make us ritually pure. So that's a whole nother argument. But they agree that one may block its flow with vessels and immerse oneself in it, but the vessels with which the flow is blocked are not immersed. So they do agree that with this rainwater situation, that you could create a temporary dam that would be sufficient, that would allow you to gather enough to make it a official mikveh. But you have to realize that the objects that are being used would not be considered in the mikveh itself. Yes, Aaron.
How is it you can use the vessel? Because I thought just a few chapters earlier, we learned that if you use a vessel to stop the flow in water, it invalidates the mikveh.
So I absolutely expected that question, and I'm glad you were paying attention. So if you, go back just a couple Mishnayot, it wasn't even another chapter, just the same chapter, just a few Mishnahs ago, we saw that if you block off the flow of that the mixed dripping and flowing water, that it needed to be done in a way that wouldn't be using a object susceptible to ritual impurity, i.e. a vessel. Here we seem to be using a vessel. What is the difference? Well, that was the mixed flow of a dripping and flowing water, whereas this is our rainwater torrent. So the rainwater torrent is being given a special dispensation, a special standing in this particular argument. Now, I haven't seen a good explanation of why it's getting that special dispensation, so I'm going to head off that question. But the ruling does seem to be treating it differently. Now, how often do you get a flash flood? Well, if you live in the land of Israel, fairly often in the right seasons. In fact, every year there are often tragedies where someone will be caught up in a flash flood because they were in an area, what's called a wadi, Nachal, that the water can add up from the rain very, very fast, and it gets a lot bigger than 40 seahs. And people do have to be very, very careful about that. So they seem to consider this a special, if infrequent occurrence, but I haven't been able to see exactly why there's this differentiation between that water and the water that comes from the earlier category of the drip flow.
But Rabbi, I thought the mixing one, when it was valid, was the few chapters before, and then when it wasn't mixing, just the final stopping point was the vessel, it became invalid, and then you get this one.
Well, it depends on which kind of mixing you're talking about, right? So mixing from drawn water and regular waters, yes, we've talked about that for a couple chapters in different points. But there it is, the regular water, the mayim chayim that you're putting in your drawn water. Here, we're not talking about that kind of mixing, and we weren't talking about that kind of mixing with the dripping versus flowing water. That was also, both those waters were not drawn water. So yeah, as always, what I love for the Mishnah to have been laid out more in a modern style, where they put all of the types of mixing in a flow. Yeah, I would have loved that. But we have to keep going back and reminding ourselves which kind of mixing are we talking about in each category. And here we're not talking about mixing at all. We're talking about 100% rainwater that's filling up the rapid fire bath I created with my various objects. So we'll have to leave it there. We're over time.
Yeah,
and we will pick up with chapter 6 next week.
Thank you, Rabbi, for the shiur.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you all for studying. Take care.